Hello, good afternoon, and welcome. My name is Valentina Gabuzzi, and I am in charge of teacher training here at Zanichelli Editore. And on behalf of Zanichelli, I welcome you to this webinar, and I'm very happy to be here with so many of you. It's more than 1,000 of you. So this webinar, you can see the title here. The title is Into 30 Centuries Born. This is a webinar that explores the literary canon and reflects on what is canonical or may become canonical. And in a way, it's an opportunity to reflect together on which of the many contemporary authors, the many contemporary voices can be chosen and why, and what can be covered also in the classroom. And as you can see, we have an extraordinary guide, Mr. Tim Parks. Hello, Tim.
Hi, I'm Valentina.
So Tim Parks hardly needs an introduction, but I will be happy to say a few words. First of all, he is many different things. He is an author. He's the author of several novels, including Europa, which was shortlisted for the prestigious Booker Prize. Some of his novels are translated in Italy by Adelphi and also other publishers. Then he is a translator. He translates from Italian into English very important Italian writers, such as Moravia, Calvino, Pavese, Pasolini. And he's also a regular contributor to important magazines, such as the New York Book Review of Books, the London Review of Books, and the Time Literary Supplement. And finally, of course, if you are using Performer Heritage Second Edition by Marina Spiazzi, Marina Tavella, and Margaret Layton, I am sure you have seen the videos Tim's take with his original perspective on several seminal authors. So now, Tim, I have talked too much, so I give you this virtual stage is all for you.
Okay, hello everybody. It's obviously an honor to be here. It's an honor to be talking to so many teachers and to be talking about the teaching of the literature of my country and my language. So many thanks to you, many thanks to Zanichelli. And let's get going without more ado. So, into 30 centuries born, at home in them all, but the very last. Edwin Muir wrote these lines in perhaps his most celebrated poem in 1956, and they expressed a sentiment that I think we've all felt, and that I think to a great extent conditions our teaching of literature. It's more or less 30 centuries since Troy fell, and since Western literature with Homer began. And we feel we know these centuries, they're ours to possess, and we know them to a great extent through literature and through books. We know the heroes, we know the heroines, we can identify them, and we can imagine ourselves in the past. So Muir goes on, we meet ourselves at every turn in the long country of the past. There the fallen are up again, in mortality's second day. There the indisputable dead rise in flesh more fine than clay. So literature is mortality's second day and finer than the original flesh. Certainly a lot easier to understand when it's been given form and dramatic clarity. He goes on. Ilium burns before our eyes, for 30 centuries never put out, and we walk the streets of Troy and breathe in the air its fabulous name. The king, the courtier, and the rout shall never perish in that flame. Old Priam shall become a boy, forever changed, forever the same. So, however great the conflagrations of the past, it remains to a certain extent stable. We feel at home in its pages and in the pages of old books, and nobody actually dies there because we can read their lives over and over again. We know what those lives are in British literature. Quick list, just a few: The Wife of Bath, Hamlet, Macbeth, Robinson Crusoe, Gulliver, Tristram Shandy, The Ancient Mariner, Elizabeth Bennet, Jane Eyre, David Copperfield, Dorian Gray, Stephen Dedalus, Mrs. Dalloway, Lady Chatterley. We know all these characters. We can put them in chronological order. We can teach them confidently. We feel fairly safe around them. And this is true of all the centuries, but the very last, our own century, where we actually live, but ironically, perhaps, don't feel so at ease. The present and the imminent future are so much more threatening than these figures from the past. Saumur says, tomorrow sounds the great alarm that puts the histories to rout. Tomorrow, and tomorrow brings endless beginning without end. It's curious to notice how Muir spells tomorrow in the archaic way with the hyphen, almost as if it was a verb, as it was something going on and on, tomorrow and tomorrow. Endless beginning, a process, not beginnings, without end. So we feel lost in the present. We don't know its shape. It just moves on. So it happens, I think, that when we teach literature, more or less everybody will simply stop at a convenient point where, as it were, the contemporary begins, where we begin to lose a sense of shape. Perhaps we stop before the Second War. Perhaps we stop with a victory gin with Winston Smith in 1984, which was, of course, written in 1948. And of course, we say that the curriculum is too long and that we don't have time. And of course, that's true, probably is very true. But it's not the whole truth, because there are certain authors who, of course, we will never drop. We will never drop Shakespeare, never drop Dickens. And the danger, of course, is that we give students the impression that maybe literature is something that only belongs to the past and that is over and so irrelevant. And it would be very dangerous if we gave this impression. So I want to talk a little bit today about this, and I want to wonder how we can at least say something about contemporary literature in English and about the relation of the contemporary to the past. Better still, maybe, how we can use our difficulties with the present and the contemporary to teach the literature of the past more persuasively and to give the students a sense of their own position in relation to literature, past and present. Let's just have a look at then at our aims quickly, one of these awful slides that one is always encouraged to introduce. To use our difficulties with the present and the contemporary to teach the literature of the past more persuasively. To give our students a sense of their own position in relation to literature, past and present. I want to insist a lot on this. I genuinely believe, and certainly it was true in all my teaching, although I was teaching at the university, but I think with young people and people in general, if people can feel that the literature is inviting them to take a position in relation to it, a position which has to do with their lives and with the present and the past, then they will be more interested and more engaged. It will mean more to them. And let us also remember that the past becomes part of the present when we take a position in relation to it. The present is full of the past. I mean, we only need to look at today's politics and the various wars and so on to understand that being in the present is very largely a question of taking a position in relation to things that happened in the past. So, if we think about contemporary literature, there are certain challenges that are very obvious, two very big ones: what to teach and, of course, what to say about it. And the reasons why those are such challenges is because there are so many novels published in English every year. At least 100,000, it is calculated. That is supposed to be a modest calculation. And of course, there are literally hundreds of fiction prizes every year. You know, the big names, the Pulitzer, the National Book Award, the Booker, the Costa Book Award, but there are many, many others. And of course, the result of this is that even if we wanted just read the prize winners, we wouldn't be able to do it possibly in a year, let alone to teach them. So what to do about this situation? Well, let's go back into the past and see Virginia Woolf thinking about the same thing in an essay in 1916, which she called Hours in a Library. Here she is. To stand in a great bookshop, crammed with books, books so new that their pages almost stick together, has an excitement no less delightful than the old excitement of the second-hand bookstore. It isn't perhaps so exalted, but the old hunger to know what the immortals thought has given place to a far more tolerant curiosity to know what our own generation is thinking. So contemporary books tell us about the present, even when the author's talking about the past, it tells us what present authors are thinking about the past. And Woolf finds this exciting. But it's worth noticing also that she talks of different kinds of emotions when approaching the books of the past and the present. There's an exalted sense when coming to the classics, the immortals, and that changes into a tolerant curiosity when approaching our contemporaries, who, of course, are all too mortals. So we know that we are, to an extent, in awe of the classics, and we should be aware of this and wary of this. We give them our consent immediately. We don't discuss with the students whether the books are good or not, or whether they're worth teaching. But when we approach contemporaries, we know we need tolerance, and we enter a realm of uncertainty. We could go to a great Italian writer for a little bit of reflection on this. Let me read you in my no doubt dreadful accent a little text here. I'll have to hang on, move something, because se oggi uscisse alla luce un poema uguale o superiore di pregio intrinseco all'Iliade, letto anche attentissimamente da qualunque più perfetto giudice di cose poetiche, gli riuscirebbe assai men grato e men dilettevole di quella, e pertanto gli resterebbe in molto minore estimazione, perché le virtù proprie del poema nuovo non sarebbero aiutate dalla fama di 27 secoli, né da 1000 memorie e 1000 rispetti, come sono le virtù dell'Iliade. As you probably guessed, that is Giacomo Leopardi in 1824 in his Il Parini o della Gloria essay. But we can see that he's saying something similar to what Woolf is saying, that the classic is part of an established culture that we all share, and that when we approach it, we enjoy a warmth of belonging to that culture and joining the generations who admired it. And the contemporary doesn't give us this. The contemporary is more precarious. So how can we choose books to teach from the contemporary? Of course, inevitably, the most obvious thing to do if we can't read them all is to restrict ourselves to the most celebrated and the most sold. But even that changes quite rapidly. For example, if we concentrated just on Britain and looked at the 1980s, we might see these names: Anthony Burgess, Muriel Sparks, Salman Rushdie, Martin Amis, Ian McEwan, Julian Barnes, Pat Barker, Kazuo Ishiguro, Angela Carter, Graham Swift. But there are only a few of them there. I mean, obviously, there are many, many more. If we go to the 90s, these might seem bigger names: Qureshi, Bainbridge, Ian Sinclair, Jonathan Cole, Ben Okri, Irving Welsh, Roddy Doyle, Louis de Bernier, Arundhati Roy, J.M. Coetzee. And if we go to the 2000s, again, we might have a completely different List of names: A.D. Smith, David Mitchell, Hilary Mantel, Mark Haddon, Ali Smith, Monica Ali, Rachel Cusk, Edward St. Auban, Alan Hollinghurst, Colm Toybin. We notice too that there are more ethnicities joining the group, that the group is more heterogeneous. And if we moved on, of course, to the more recent books, we might have more names. We might have Sally Rooney, we might have Hisham Matar, we might have Samantha Harvey, David Saloy, and many others. And very few people would agree who were the main writers of this period. Someone might even say Tim Parks. In fact, reading that list, I realized that I published in all of those decades, which is quite frightening. I only just realized that right now, actually. Let's go back to Virginia Woolf then in her bookshop. How does she think about this? She says, from these new books, these many, many books, our children will select the one or two by which we shall be known forever. Here, if we could recognize it, lies some poem or novel or history which will stand up and speak with other ages about our age, when we lie prone and silent, as the crowd of Shakespeare's day is silent and lives for us only in the pages of his poetry. So what she's saying here is we can enjoy these new books, we can love them or hate them, but actually it won't be us who decide which ones survive. It can't be us. So we can have our opinions, but this is really not our responsibility. This will be a responsibility in the future. Our job is just to start sifting the text, to start reading them and talking about them. So this is actually quite a liberating thought to have, that we don't have this responsibility, that we can't, as it were, teach the wrong book, because we are inviting the students to participate in the job of arriving finally at who will be recognized as the important writers of this period. Let me say also that this problem was always the case. It was never clear that a writer was the greatest writer, the writer who would survive. Certainly in Shakespeare's period, many realized that he was a great writer, but they didn't go around saying, oh, the greatest dramatist the English language will ever know, or things like that. In fact, some of them were quite disparaging about Shakespeare. Conversely, of course, many writers who were considered great in the past have now disappeared without trace. Many writers who are as famous as, say, Rushdie or Zadie Smith today have completely disappeared. And it's worth reminding students about this. It doesn't take very long to do, but I think it's quite useful. Just let's have a quick list of writers who have disappeared. Sir Edward Bulwer-Lytton, a novelist, poet and playwright, now almost entirely forgotten. He was the man who wrote the phrase, "The pen is mightier than the sword." And in fact, that phrase remained, but almost nothing else that he has done. There's George Meredith, 1828 to 1909. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize 7 times and considered for a while the greatest British novelist, but most people don't even know his name. And in fact, Meredith is quite difficult to read now with much pleasure. There's G.M. Reynolds, who was more popular than Dickens or Thackeray in his time. The most published man of the 19th century, he's often referred to. His work, again, has disappeared without trace, despite the quite extraordinary sales. His book, his novel, The Soldier's Wife, sold 60,000 on the day of publication. There were women as well, of course. I'm just having a little problem because we've got some people raising hands. Can I ask you to leave that to the end? Because otherwise we won't have time to get through. So there are a number of women who were considered very great writers in their time. Felicia Dorothy Hemans, one of the most popular poets of her time. Second only to Byron in terms of sales. Her poem Casabianca, which was a very patriotic poem, a kind of cuore sort of thing, a De Amicis sort of book. I remember as a child learning this particular verse from Casabianca. The boys stood on the burning deck. It's a military naval battle, whence all but he had fled. The flame that lit the battle's wreck shone round him o'er the dead. This kind of poem has gone completely out of favor today. We might also talk about Marie Corelli, who was a melodramatic novelist, and her novel, The Murder of Delicia, sold 52,000 copies in its first year. It's worth saying that kind of almost nobody these days sells that kind of number, except it's a very rare event to sell 52,000 copies in a year. Never mind the man who sold 60,000 in a week of the first installment of his novel. Certainly, I've never sold quantities like that in such a short time. There were also novelists in the past and writers in the past who were not considered at the time and are now being recovered. Got a little trouble here. One of them, for example, Aphra Behn, who was a playwright, poet, and translator. One of the first women to earn her living as a writer. She wrote this strange book, Oroonoko, I don't know how to pronounce it, or The Royal Slave, which is an early kind of novel. And it was Virginia Woolf who contributed to recovering Aphra Behn's reputation and said, all women together ought to let flowers fall upon the tomb of Aphra Behn. So why am I talking to you about this now? Aphra Behn being included now in the canon in some teaching at the universities, and then other books, of course, being gradually excluded, perhaps because of some relation with slavery, or because of some unsavory view, perhaps an anti-Semitic view. There are problems, as we know, even with Shakespeare today. Recently, the Royal Shakespeare Company website warned that the Merry Wives of Windsor included fat shaming, so that you wonder if Shakespeare will ever be put to one side or edited in a particular way. Let's have a look at the Royal Shakespeare Company's website on that. This is just copied from their website. The Merry Wives of Windsor content advice. The play contains adultery. Oh my God. How worrying. Violence. Bullying in the form of body shaming. Of course, it's Falstaff. How can we have Falstaff without having body shaming? Falstaff's identity is being fat, as it were. Manipulative and domineering behavior. Worst of all, references to alcohol and characters drinking alcohol on stage. Can you imagine that in the United Kingdom? And references to drugs and characters taking drugs on stage. So all these kinds of new attitudes to the past, new worries about the past, are now being expressed. And I mention this really just to say to you that the past is not as stable, perhaps, as it seems, that the past changes with the present and changes with our opinions about the present. So that when we teach the past to the students, we should make students aware that new authors come from the past to meet us, like Aphra Behn, while other authors are, as it were, taken away from us. And in fact, at a certain point of his poem, Edwin Muir says of those figures in the past, is it fantasy or faith? that keeps intact that marvelous show and saves the helpless dead from harm, indicating that, in fact, it is our fantasy and our faith that keeps the literature of the past in its place. We know that writers, even a writer like Shakespeare, was largely forgotten in the 17th century, or very rarely played in the late 17th and early 18th century, that Donne and the metaphysical poets were also largely put aside until T.S. Eliot resurrected them. So the past is a work in progress in the present, and our teaching is part of that job of constantly revising the past. And we can use this reflection to make our consideration of the past more immediate for students and to help them prepare, I think, for the challenge of looking at contemporary novels. So I'm going to suggest something rather dangerous, perhaps, that we might problematize the past a little bit when we teach it in order to prepare our students for the contemporary. So how could you do this? Let me take three examples from the canon and from the anthologies that we all teach, and just suggest one or two things. I notice, for example, that when teaching the metaphysical poets, this label metaphysical is introduced as if it were some kind of genuine description of the content of their poetry, or even a complimentary recognition of its seriousness. But actually, the first use of the word metaphysical with regard to these poets was, in fact, a mockery, a taunt. Donne and his contemporaries attempted to abstract poetry to metaphysical ideas and scholastic quiddities. This is the Scottish poet William Drummond, speaking in 1630. Or again, John Donne affects the metaphysics, not only in his satires, but in his amorous verses, where nature only should reign, and perplexes the minds of the fair sex with nice speculations of philosophy, when he should engage their hearts and entertain them with the softnesses of love. This wouldn't be a very popular approach to take today, but this is John Dryden speaking in 1693. Or again, and this is probably the most famous, the metaphysical poets were men of learning, and to show their learning was their whole endeavor. That's quite a criticism. The most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. Nature and art are ransacked for illustrations, comparisons, and allusions. Their learning instructs, and their subtlety surprises. But the reader commonly thinks his improvement dearly bought, and though he sometimes admires, is seldom pleased. And this is Samuel Johnson in 1779. And Johnson actually gives us a little criticism of one poem, which is actually in your anthology, or at least in the Zanichelli anthology, as I recall. It might be fun to present students with this and ask them what they think. So here he is. Again, I'm going to have to do some moving of my... The tears of lovers are always of great poetical account, but Donne has extended them into worlds. And he quotes this poem. Let's take it slowly. On a round ball, a workman that hath copies by can lay an Europe, Africa, and an Asia, and quickly make that which was nothing all. So doth each tear which thee doth wear a globe, yea, world, by that impression grow, till thy tears mixed with mine do overflow this world, by waters sent from thee, my heaven dissolved so. And Samuel Johnson comments, if the lines are not easily understood, they may be read again. And I must admit, I struggled quite a deal to understand those last lines there. But this is also the very poem that T.S. Eliot comments on so positively in his essay on the metaphysical poets in 1921, where he talks about Donne creating a fusion of intellect and sense. He writes, Donne felt thought as immediately as the odor of a rose. He had a direct sensual apprehension of thought. That's from T.S. Eliot in his essay, The Metaphysical Poets, in 1921, which brought them back into the canon after they'd long been neglected. So why not invite the students to take a position on this? Are they with Eliot? Are they with Johnson? Or do they realize that? Are they interested in the question? Another thing on all our always in the canon is Gulliver's Travels. But Gulliver's Travels, of course, was hugely criticized when it came out. Here's one comment. Swift's writings endeavor to debase the human and to raise above it the brutal nature. And this is Samuel Richardson. Basically, Swift was being accused of being misanthropist and obscene. Here's another comment. Gulliver's Travels presents human nature itself in the worst light. True humor ought to be kept up with decency and dignity, or it loses every tincture of entertainment. Descriptions that shock our delicacy cannot have the least good effect upon our mind. Is that true? Descriptions that shock our delicacy cannot have a good effect upon our minds. Who was it who said this? John Boyle, the 5th Earl of Orrery, who was in fact quite a respected literary man at the time. Of course, what these men were thinking of were things like the description of the yahoos, the invention of the yahoos, who at first we feel are some horrible, filthy animal, and then we discover that they are in fact human. Here is Gulliver's first meeting of the yahoos. I ran to the body of a tree and, leaning my back against it, kept them off by waving my sword. Several of this cursed brood, getting hold of the branches behind, leapt up into the tree, whence they began to discharge their excrements on my head. Swift famously is very frequently referring to excrements in his writing. There are also more politically problematic questions. For example, when Gulliver meets the King of Brobdingnag and is invited to talk about the culture he comes from, he's very enthusiastic about Britain's armies and the explosives that they have developed, and how many battles they have won. And the King of Brobdingnag says, "My little friend, I cannot but conclude the bulk of your natives to be the most pernicious race of little odious vermin that nature ever suffered to crawl upon the surface of the earth." And there, of course, Swift was talking about the British, and many of the British were very unhappy. Of course, when we talk about the metaphysical poets or Swift, we're before the period of regular reviews in newspapers. But if we consider maybe one last thing in our canon, and indeed any of the works from the 19th century, we can always quickly find on the internet a couple of contemporary reviews of the books to see how difficult reviewers found it to understand what was good in a book, and how often these books caused quite violent debate. It's a mistake, I think, actually, to criticize the reviewers as short-sighted or in some way. stupid. They were simply dealing with things that were new to them. And their difficulty with the text shows us how exciting the text is. What about Tess of the D'Urbervilles? A pure woman faithfully presented. Here's one review. This novel is the history, Mr. Hardy tells us, par excellence, of a pure woman, which is his flag or trumpet, so to speak, of defiance upon certain matters to the ordinary world. This is Mrs. Oliphant, who was a Scottish novelist of some success at the time. Notice that when she says certain matters, she doesn't even want to name them, which is the whole question of Tess being a kept woman, not preserving her virginity, living in sin with another man. And the question is, how can she be a pure woman, which is indeed a provocation from Hardy's point of view, if you like. He knew that this kind of response would come. Mr. Hardy has told an extremely disagreeable story in an extremely disagreeable manner, which is not rendered less so by his affectation of expounding a great moral law, or by the ridiculous character of some of the scenes into which this affectation plunges the reader. It's true that some of the scenes in Tess of the D'Urbervilles are very strange, as when Tess lies down on a Stone Age altar in Salisbury Plain, for example, imagining herself a sacrifice to the gods. And that is Mowbray Morris, who was one of the 2 or 3 leading critics of the time. There's another famous comment on Tess of the D'Urbervilles, vile. That was Robert Louis Stevenson, the great Robert Louis Stevenson. So there was a lot of debate about these books. I'm going to include one more quote because it's my favorite. This is a really wonderful one. The Duchess of Abercorn tells me that the novel, Tess, has saved her all future trouble in the assortment of her friends. They have been almost fighting across her dinner table over Tess's character. What she now says to them is, do you support her or not? And if they say, no, indeed, she deserved hanging, a little harlot, she puts them in one group. And if they say, poor wronged innocent, and pity her, she puts them in the other group, where she is herself. And that is Lord Salisbury talking about his friend, the Duchess of Abercorn. It's interesting how the novel divided polite society completely over this question of Tess's purity. And it tells us an awful lot about the time, but also about how our own appreciation of literature depends on context and belief. So if we come away from those situations, if we accept that each great work, when it comes out, creates debate and controversy, it's no surprise if we start thinking now of some of the most celebrated of our contemporary authors. Perhaps let's mention Ishiguro or Coetzee or Rushdie or Rachel Cusk, Zadie Smith, Sally Rooney. It's no surprise that all of these writers have been seriously criticized and contested, and often criticized and contested by each other. For example, Rachel Cusk attacks Ishiguro. Rushdie attacks Coetzee. Coetzee attacks Rushdie. Zadie Smith, in a rather fabulous comment, attacks herself. And any number of people have attacked Rachel Cusk and Sally Rooney. Let's have a quick look. This is Zadie Smith on herself. I can't reread White Teeth without cringing, thanks to its flaws in characterization, to its tendency to bulk out the narrative with essays about history and fundamentalism, and that daft ending. Zadie Smith. Daft is not a word, daft, stupid, not a word that generally gets taught when we teach English. This is a review of Kazuo Ishiguro's book, Never Let Me Go. That's the book about clones who are created only in order to give their organs to other people. So Ishiguro creates a reality out of his gruesome male imaginings, with every ghoulish component unrelentingly worked out, a high caste version of the tabloid newspaper's loving exposition of gory detail. This is Rachel Cusk disliking Ishiguro's book. This is a review of John Coetzee's Disgrace, which was probably the book which won him the Nobel Prize. The cold detachment which permeates the novel's prose is the problem. When a writer creates beings, when a writer's created beings lack understanding, it becomes the writer's task to provide the reader with the insight lacked by the characters. If he does not, his work will not shine a light upon darkness, but merely become part of the darkness it describes. And this is Salman Rushdie. But here's a review of Salman Rushdie's The Moor's Last Sigh. I think this was like the second book after Midnight's Children. Frantic and overwritten, ignores the most elementary rules of narrative. Rushdie's defenders claim that this is because he is a multicultural writer. Nevertheless, multiculturalism should not become a card that trumps all other critical cards. And this is J.M. Coetzee. I can't remember actually which review came first. I think Coetzee's review came before Rushdie's. I'm not quite sure. One thing that you should notice about these criticisms is that there are political elements in them. Cusk accuses Ishiguro of a sick male vision. So there's an element there of gender politics, which would be typical of Rachel Cusk. Rushdie accuses Coetzee of not enlightening the world, as if this was the job of literature. And Coetzee accuses Rushdie of hiding behind a multicultural agenda. So when we look at any contemporary books and people's reaction to them, we have to ask how far taste can be separated from a political position, particularly in the question of literature, which of course talks about the world. Let's go back to the past again for a minute, not to Virginia Woolf, but to her uncle James Fitzjames Stephen. Let's have a look at him. He's writing here as I recall, in the 1850s. Another curious case of an extrinsic disturbing force acting upon novels is to be found in the habit, which of late years has become so common, of using novels to ventilate opinions. And he means political opinions. Novels are made use of as social or political argumenta ad misericordia. So the idea is that the novel presents, for example, poverty and blames the government for it, or blames capitalism for it. Elizabeth Gaskell's Mary Barton, a book which he admires, he says, is in fact a party pamphlet, a political party pamphlet. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre abused the license of her art in exaggerating the cruelty of Lowood School, causing great distress to its charitable founders. In fact, Charlotte Bronte did apologize to the owners of the school because she hadn't realized that the school would be recognized and criticized, and because she had indeed greatly exaggerated the sufferings of students at the school. So Stephen is suggesting that the novelist has a responsibility if he's going to present the world in realistic terms, and that understandably people's reactions to the books will be partly political. He talks a lot about Dickens, just a couple of quotations. Dickens' whole art is to take a melancholy subject and rub the reader's nose in it. Dickens shows exquisite skill in producing a sustained flow of spirit and drollery. However, there is a difference between the skill of the production of literary effects and skill in the verification and employment of alleged evidence. Stephen was himself a lawyer. And he comes up with this remark, which I think is the most important of these. We feel no doubt that one principal cause of his popularity is the spirit of revolt against all established rules which pervades every one of his books, an exquisite adaptation of his own turn of mind to the peculiar state of feeling which prevails in some classes, a harmony between his own temper and that of his audience. So what he's suggesting here is that we admire books, contemporary books, certainly to a degree, because we agree with their politics, because they're in the same spirit. And you could ask yourselves, the present, how much of our interest, say, in a writer like Rushdie, has to do with the whole question, the fatwa, and so on and so forth. So let's have another quick quote here from Virginia Woolf. In that famous essay, which I referred to before, she says, no age of literature is so little submissive to authority as ours, so free from the dominion of the great. None seems so wayward with its gifts of reverence, or so volatile in its experiments. It may well seem, even to the attentive, there is no trace of school or aim in the work of our poets and novelists. And she's saying how difficult it is with modern novels because they're so eclectic, because they seem to have abandoned standard ways of describing the world. And she, of course, was one of the first people to do that. Still, if we think about it, and of course she's talking about modernism, and she's talking about the problem of having a narrative about the world when the values of society are changing. But if you think about it, at least for Virginia Woolf and for Stephen, British society was still quite homogeneous. Whereas if we look at the kind of authors we're talking about now, many of them come from other traditions, and we have a much more multicultural situation, which makes it even more difficult for us to get a grip on what the situation is with contemporary literature. For example, if we just look at the writers that I've mentioned, Katsia is South African originally, now holds Australian citizenship, educated in South Africa, worked as a computer programmer in the UK, took a PhD in the USA, and his most famous novel, Disgrace, is set in South Africa. Salman Rushdie, born in Mumbai, but studied at one of the most exclusive schools in England, and has British citizenship. His books are mostly set in India, where he's only rarely lived, actually, spending most of his life in London and New York. Kazuo Ishiguro is Japanese by birth, but moved to Britain when he was 6 and didn't return to Japan for 30 years. He remarked in interview that he understood very early that his ethnicity was an asset in literary circles. So his first 2 novels were set in a Japan which he didn't know at all. Zadie Smith, Zadie Smith's very, very English. Her mother from the West Indies, her father English, and a hugely successful first book, White Teeth, focuses on various ethnic communities. So this is a huge richness, of course, but it's also makes it so much more complicated to get a sense of what's going on. It also sometimes makes us wonder, if politics and identity haven't become important factors in the creation of a literary reputation. Okay, so to finish, hopefully I'm not going to go over my time or not by too much. I just want to have a look at 5 titles which we might consider as emblematic and which we might at least say something to the students about, and in one or two cases invite them to read, perhaps not all of them, or certainly not all of them anyway. I don't think there's any danger of the children suddenly reading 5 novels in English. I wish there was. How did I choose these books? Obviously, the importance and prominence of the authors is important. It would be foolish to choose a name that nobody knew. I think it wouldn't help us. And that means that when we choose these authors, we also choose major themes of our time, since the authors who are most famous do in fact deal with subjects, globalization, multiculturalism, and so on and so forth. I think when choosing books, it's important to choose books about which you yourself have a strong opinion, positive or negative, to show a certain level of engagement with the material, that it's important for you. And also to choose books that are to a certain extent in dialogue with each other, that students understand that the books don't exist on their own, but in a context of rival visions of the world, if we want. So I'm going to start with a few words about Rushdie. His most famous book, of course, is Midnight's Children, but that is so vast and tangled. I'm going to say a word about Haroun and the Sea of Stories, which is a book he wrote for younger readers. What's the plot? Haroun, this is taken directly from the book, the only child of the storyteller Rashid Khalifa, whose never-ending stream of tall, short, and winding tales had earned him not one but 2 nicknames. To his admirers, he was Rashid, the ocean of notions, as stuffed with cheery stories as the sea was full of glumfish. But to his jealous rivals, he was the Shah of Blah. So we have a storyteller. Much of Rushdie's writing is about storytellers, and largely, of course, about himself being a storyteller. Haroun often thought of his father as a juggler because his stories were really lots of different tales juggled together, and Rashid kept them going in a sort of dizzy whirl and never made a mistake. This is recognizably the kind of text that Coetzee objected to as not obeying any of the rules of storytelling. The storyteller is always a positive, eclectic figure in Rushdie's writing. Where did all these stories come from? Haroun asks. From the great story sea, Rashid would reply. I drink the warm story waters and then I feel full of steam. So stories, notice, are being aligned with the environment. They're a kind of ecology. And in the great story sea, different colored stories flow harmoniously together. The story of the book is that an evil cult master, Katam Shud, goes around the ocean in a black ship, poisoning the source of the stories. And here we have someone who begins to look a little bit like the Ayatollah Khomeini, who insists on a kind of monoculture rather than an eclectic culture. He says these concentrated poisons are what we have been releasing one by one into the ocean of stories. And the young Haroun, Rashid's son, confronts Katam Shud, and the story is all about Haroun, as it were, contesting Katam Shud. Why do you hate stories so much? Haroun blurted out. Stories are fun. The world is not for fun, Katam Shud replied. The world is for controlling. And this is a polarity, the relationship between pleasure and control, which is constant in contemporary literature. So just one thing, I'm going to be very quick, very sketchy on these to suggest the relation of these books to each other. But it's worth noticing that when we read the names of Haroun and Rashid, which of course are taken from the Arabian Nights, Many of the exotic names in the story are from Hindustani. We have the impression of a book from India, but in fact, when we look at the style and the cultural references, the language seems that of English children's books, fables and rhymes, and the literary references are to Coleridge, Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, Conrad, Tolkien. So what we're looking at, curiously, is India as it were digested by British culture. It's a very curious thing, and I think quite a complicated phenomenon to understand. Let me go on to the most difficult book. Difficult not in terms of reading, but difficult in terms of presenting. And I think Disgrace is a book that you should certainly read before you recommend it to anybody, and certainly recommend only to the most mature students, because this is a very challenging book. But I present it because it seems to me absolutely crucial for understanding a debate about multicultural issues and how they present themselves in contemporary writing. David Lurie, divorced, a professor of communications in Cape Town, has an affair with a student, as a result of which he loses his job. He goes to stay with his daughter, who lives alone in the South African countryside, but their house is attacked by a group of young men and she is raped. Oh, these scenes are very strong. David and his daughter can't agree about the nature of the crime. She marries a neighboring farmer, Petrus, who already has 2 other wives, acknowledging the historical guilt of her ancestors and accepting local Afrikaans customs. David, the professor, retires to a home for stray dogs, giving to animals the affection his daughter has rejected, and spending his time composing an opera about Byron on his old banjo. He is completely alien and irrelevant to the new post-colonial world that he lives in. So when we look at a story like Disgrace, which I very quickly summarized, you can see at once that there is no question here of stories flowing harmoniously together. They contrast with each other. I'll just give you one quotation from the book about Petrus, the man who David's daughter marries, a black farmer who actually knows who raped the daughter. Petrus is a man of his generation. Doubtless Petrus has been through a lot. Doubtless he has a story to tell. David would not mind hearing Petrus's story one day, but preferably not in English. More and more, he is convinced that English is an unfit medium for the truth of South Africa. Stretches of English code, whole sentences long, have thickened, lost their articulations, their articulateness, their articulatedness. Like a dinosaur expiring and settling in the mud, the language has stiffened. Pressed into the mold of English, Petrus's story would come out arthritic, bygone. So in this situation, whereas Rushdie can talk about India with references from English, Coetzee is saying we can't even talk about this South African man in English because the story would in some sense be falsified. Let's go on to something much lighter, Zadie Smith's White Teeth. This book is just impossible to summarize. It's such a rambling, jolly book. But let me just give you a quick word. The novel presents the Bengali and West Indian minorities, 2 largest post-colonial minorities in the UK, in a reassuring, affectionate fashion. Their English is comically poor. Their aspirations seem similar to the British working classes, with whom they are very much aligned. So the book opens with a dramatic situation. This is just to give you an example, where a man is trying to commit suicide because his marriage has broken down in his car in a street outside a Bengali butcher's shop. And the Bengali men are very worried about this, and they run out and say, "Do you hear that, mister? We are not licensed for suicides around here. This place halal, kosher, understand? If you're going to die around here, my friend, I'm afraid you've got to be thoroughly bled first." So this is kind of fun comedy. Let's see how you feel about it when the voices she does are Italian voices, because the man who is committing suicide has left his Italian wife, and all her Italian relatives have come to visit her. "Look at him," said one of the Italian grandmothers, the more glamorous one with the big scarves and fewer moles. "He take everything, capisci? He take her mind, he take the blender, he take the old stereo, he take everything except the floorboard. It make you sick." So Zadie Smith does voices. She has fun, and the result is that everybody seems reassuringly quite innocuous, except the white family, who come to know all these Bengali people. Let me talk. This is another moment when she presents the black mother of her heroine, who is meeting her boyfriend for the first time. This is about the birth of the heroine of the book. This woman gave him a wide grin that revealed possibly her one imperfection, a complete lack of teeth in the top of her mouth. "Man, they get knocked out," she lisped, seeing his surprise. "But I think to myself, come the end of the world, the Lord won't mind if I have no tooths." And notice that tooths is a word that children, it's a mistake that children make. Her boyfriend is Ryan, and he was red as a beetroot, and Clara was black as yearboot. Okay, so even their colors rhyme, as it were. So this is all very, very positive in the mixing of, as it were, of nations. Whereas then there's this white family, the Chalfans, a professor. Chalfan is a professor of genetics. And so we have the Chalfans had no friends. They interacted mainly with the Chalfan extended family. The good genes, which were so often referred to, 2 scientists, 1 mathematician, 3 psychiatrists, and a young cousin working for the Labour Party. Bottom line, the Chalfans didn't need other people. Again, we have the idea of a monoculture and a control culture in opposition to a more open world. He's a scientist, but what is his science? Choosing who shall be born and who shall not, breeding people as if they were so many chickens, destroying them if the specifications are not correct. He wants to control, to dictate the future. He wants a race of men, a race of indestructible men that will survive the last days of Earth. This is not unlike the cult master in Haroun, and the opposition is pretty much the same. Well, I have a couple more examples I will try to get through. I see I'm dangerously near overrunning my time, but we'll just look very quickly at 2 other books that might open this kind of discussion a bit more. I think one book that students might really be able to read and enjoy, which is very much aimed at young adults, is Sally Rooney's Normal People. Let's remember the plot of that if you don't know it. Marianne, the daughter of a wealthy solicitor, falls in love with Connell, the son of the woman who cleans a house. Marianne's rich parents are aggressive and controlling. Connell's poor mother, a single mother, is sympathetic but doesn't tell her son who her father is. So the dysfunctional relation between Marianne and Connell, which is what the novel is about, can be generally attributed to the circumstances of their growing up, blamed on their parents, if you like. There are three polarities of value in this book: generation, class, and intellectual ability. So young and old, poor and rich, smart and stupid. That's very much how the book works out. For example, here, Connell talking to his mother says, Marianne wouldn't go out with someone like me. What does that mean, someone like you? I think her new boyfriend is a bit more in line with her social class. Okay. But Connell likes when Marion tells her friends, people whose fathers are judges and government ministers, people who went to inordinately expensive schools, that Connell is the smartest person they will ever meet. So Connell, being poor and not of Marion's class, becomes acceptable because he's very smart. But being very smart, him and Marion are then very competitive. And here we have them talking about their exam results. I got an A1, he says. What did you get in German? An A1, she says. Are you bragging? You're going to get 600, are you? She shrugs. You probably will, she says. Well, you're smarter than me. Don't feel bad, I'm smarter than everyone. It's the whole book is a mix of this competitiveness and affection, if we want. And success is to be understood in the book in terms of social success and climbing the social ladder, if you like. But the victim of this is very much love, and it keeps bothering their relationship. Some critics were not impressed. In the hugely successful Normal People, the tender, loving couple comprised the super bright Marianne and the sexy son of her family's maid. For moves like this, Rooney has been praised as a Marxist novelist. I actually think the novel is rather brilliant and very, very readable, even if it does all seem kind of frighteningly clear sometimes. But it's certainly a good read and something that students can take on. Again, notice that control is very important. Control is scholastic success, is controlling the narrative of your relationship, and so on and so forth. So one last book I'll look at, and then we'll finish. Just I realize I'm being rather hurried with this. I want to say a word about Rachel Cusk, her novel Outline. Rachel Cusk very much into gender wars, as I said. The protagonist, a woman writer and author alter ego teaching creative writing in Greece, has extended conversations with men and women, all of which revolve around love, marriage, illusion, and disillusion. And essentially, love is seen as a brief illusion of harmony, invariably followed by ferocious antagonism. And the book maps the strange transitions from enchantment to disenchantment in each couple. That is, the world, everything is seen in terms of conflict. And I think that's true of all the books we've looked at, and indeed of many contemporary novels, as if the only way of talking about people was in their rivalry with each other. The marriage was already unhappy, a tremendous battle of wills in which no one ever succeeded in separating the combatants, except very briefly when they died, and even not for long, because then they get buried together. They were struggling to free themselves from one another, yet the very last thing they could do was leave one another alone. They fought over everything, disputed ownership of the most inconsequential item, were enraged by the merest nuance of speech. The book, in a strange way, becomes a kind of symbol of the whole world's tendency these days to polarize into debates that can't be resolved. Their argument could never be resolved, not so long as the aim was to establish the truth, for there was no single truth anymore. That was the point. There was no longer a shared vision, a shared reality even. Each of them saw things now solely from his own perspective. There was only point of view. And you can see here how close we're getting to Kurt Sear's position, where he says that he can't talk about a black man in English because their worlds are so separate. This is obviously the pessimistic side of the story. Zadie Smith and Rushdie much more positive. This was a story in which I sensed the truth was being sacrificed to the narrator's desire to win. And at the end of the book, Cusk, or the narrator, says, I had come to believe more and more in the virtues of passivity and of living a life as unmarked by self-will as possible. And here again, very similar to the end of Kurt Sear's book, where the hero retires to look after stray dogs, as if you can't take part in the world today without struggle. Again, this is the kind of debate you can open to students and say to them, does this genuinely reflect a vision of the world? What is your position on this? Is this how you see the world? Rather than presenting the book as a masterpiece, to invite students to see books in debate with each other. Let me just finish, because I have finished, you'll be glad to know. Let me just finish with a quote from the end of Muir's poem. And again, it's all about position and about movement, taking a position. Then on this moment, the present moment, the contemporary, on this moment, set your foot and take your road for everywhere. And from your roving barrier, shoot your arrow into the empty air. Follow at a careful pace, else you may wander in despair. Gathered at your moving post is all you have but memory. So we project an arrow, an ambition, an expectation into the future, and we follow it. How do we do that? We do that at our moving post with our memories and the things we know. And one of the things we know are the books we've read and the things we know about the past. Those things help us to understand our position and to decide where we're going to shoot our arrow. So that's me. I've finished. I'm perfectly aware that teaching contemporary literature in schools must be certainly among the most difficult things that an individual can attempt to do. So I wish you very much the best of luck. I believe we have time for a couple of questions. I've gone over my time a little, but perhaps there's still some time left.
Thank you, Tim. I wrote down some of the comments in the chat, and I can tell you that many of them were writing fantastic lecture, amazing stuff to work on, so many inputs. I will tell you something.
Questions.
Okay, so I have a question for you. As a reader, as a translator, as a critic, do you always recommend reading the book first before watching the movie or the TV adaptation? Or as a teacher, you can, in a way, understand that this new visual media can be, in a way, helpful to intrigue students in maybe reading and deepening the book?
Well, this is a very vexed question, and I'm going to take a position that you might not like. There are certain films and books that I very much loved, but my feeling is that the narrative form of film is an entirely different experience and mental space. It's watched in different conditions. It's much shorter. It's much more passive, whereas writing requires that you bring to it your own linguistic ability, your own knowledge, and much more of what is created in a book is created by you, which is why books change so much as you grow older and can bring more to them. So my own feeling is that the books can be made exciting as they are if we bring them into the classroom in the right way. And I certainly wouldn't be one kind of showing the movie first, as it were. On the other hand, if people have seen the movie and they go to the book because of that, but I deeply suspect that will not actually be the case. I think that might be wishful thinking.
Okay, I have another question. Literature can be seen as a way to understand an era, a past era.
Absolutely, yes.
Do you think that with contemporary literature or very contemporary literature, like the one we saw with you, this perception of understanding an era is harder?
Well, I think it is harder because let's say that we now live in a much more eclectic, mixed world, that there is no shared and agreed narrative about what human life is about, or about we don't share very much anymore a religion and a belief structure. And this means we have all different kinds of narratives going on around us, many of them competing. And it does take quite a while and a lot of reading to start making sense of what you're coming from. But what you can do is take a position yourself in regard to every particular story you read. And certainly the reason why I presented these 5 books, I could have chosen endless others, of course, but the reason why I chose them is that if I didn't really have time to bring this out, but you begin to see that these books are all taking a slightly different position on the same issues. Issues of eclecticism, issues of multi-ethnicity, issues of control, questions of what does it mean to be successful or not? What does it mean to be happy or not? Certainly, it will take a long time. It will be our children who are able to understand our age a bit better, I think, as we can understand the Victorian age probably better than the Victorians did now.
I have another question from Daniela. Do you think that translating some short passages themselves could get students to be more interested in a literary piece?
Well, I think anything that draws the student's attention for more than a few moments to the actual passage and the content and the style of a text, the way it's created, can indeed draw them close to a text. Certainly, if you look at a few lines, I don't know, you look at the opening to say the portrait of an artist as a young man, which is written in sort of baby language. And you read it in Joyce, and you say to the students, okay, 10 lines, translate it. And now let's look at Pavese's translation. And then they see that it's different. And then they see that the differences have actually changed what's going on in the text. I mean, for example, Joyce plays a lot with the pronouns in the beginning, and it's kind of fun to look at. So anything that actually engages the student, and they say, hey, this is interesting, I can think about this, will work. Your problem with a class is always that there are going to be some people who are open to that and many who aren't, and so the problem is, how do I get the people who are interested on board, while other people are wishing they were looking at their phones and so on and so forth. I mean, this is a problem at the university as well, frankly.
So in a way, you were also reflecting on Elisabetta's question, which is more related to the classic period. And the question for you is how to make classic a tiny bit more exciting for teenagers. So do you have any advice for that?
I think the classics are classics because they are exciting. So I think the problem is that why are the students not thinking of them exciting? Well, maybe one reason is that we're coming to the text saying, oh, this is a classic. This is a masterpiece. Like, you've got to like this, which means that there's going to be resistance there immediately. So, and this was really one of the reasons. I see somebody saying the best way to choose a novel is passion. That's something that I would certainly say is helpful. So when we come to the classics, one reason why in my lecture I suggested, let's tell the students that not everybody liked this book. You know, that people really hated Gulliver's Travels. People really thought the metaphysical poets were a bit crazy, introducing such strange ideas. So, I mean, let's talk about, what do you think about that? Like, if you were writing a poem, would you know, and so on and so forth. Because with every piece of literature, one simply has to remember somebody wrote this for a reason, and some people loved it and some people hated it. So let's enjoy that and let's take a position on that, you know?
Thank you. So there's people commenting that they agree it's complex but intriguing, and once again they thank you for this very interesting letter. And on behalf of Danny Kelly, I thank you as well. So thank you for being with us. Thank for all of you for being with us this afternoon. And many people are asking for a second occasion and so on. So let's be open about that.
Well, listen, thank you to everybody. I must say that I wish that I was in front of you all and we could, as it were, have eye contact, because a lot of things happen when you can actually see people and get a feeling of the room, as it were. But there are a lot of people who have been in touch here. So thank you for following. I appreciate it's been perhaps a little hurried. And yes, have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Ciao.